infantry senior officers of the different forces involved. First of the 21 guns, which will be fired over the next 21 minutes, the expected length of the procession.
Peter, you'll see that the troops are carrying their arms reversed, which is the tradition at military funerals. And they're marching at a funeral pace of 80 paces to the minute as opposed to the usual 20. You might also be wondering, many people will be wondering, at the very large RCMP presence at the funeral. The Mounties, of course, are a paramilitary force and in fact have fought in virtually all of Canada's wars from 1885, the Northwest Rebellion, through the South African War, the First War and the Second War, and Korea. And as well are now on many peacekeeping missions in a police role. So they've earned their place in this parade as much as the Army, Navy, and Air Force.
You know, for some, it's hard to personalize this story because, of course, this is an unknown soldier, but in a way there are 28,000 stories there of the unknown soldiers, seamen and airmen who have served this country and lost their lives and now lie without a marked grave. And while we don't know how he was, we do know where he came from. We do not know the battle where he lost his life. There are some things we do know. He was probably young. He certainly died in France. That was a prerequisite of the choice of these remains. And he may well have died at Vimy Ridge.
He was from a cemetery in the Vimy vicinity, so it's a good likelihood that he was killed in the Battle of Vimy Ridge. There were 650,000 members of the Canadian Expeditionary Force in the First World War. The odds are pretty good, Peter, that our veteran was either Canadian-born or British-born. 50% of the Canadian Expeditionary Force was born in Great Britain, 50% in Canada. So it's one or the other, I suppose. He was likely from Ontario or the West, likely, although he could be from any part of Canada. Likely young, as you said. Almost certainly in the infantry, where the heaviest casualties fell. Probably was in France for a relatively short period of time. Many of those who died were the young soldiers, the green soldiers who had just arrived. Probably left relatives behind him in Canada who had received only a telegram saying that your son, your brother, your husband was missing, presumed dead, and that would be, in effect, all they would know until, very simply, he never came home.
The assumption of youth is probably so well founded. I mean, we saw the story of Paul Metivier, who's lied about his age so he could get to the war. He was 16 when he left to go overseas. They finally found out about him almost a year later and sent him home, but not before he'd served with distinction and ended up winning, being awarded a number of medals. So the odds are that these remains are of a young Canadian.
You go through the cemeteries in France from the First World War, or the cemeteries in France and Flanders in the Second World War, and you cannot fail to be moved at the simple fact that almost all of the dead are Canadians in their late teens or early 20s. It's terrifying when you think of it, that teenagers and people who have scarcely had a chance to begin a life are the ones who fought our wars and paid the price.
Hill now, crossing Wellington Street, the main east-west thoroughfare that crosses directly in front of the Parliament buildings.
Those are cadets of the Royal Military College you see just passing off the screen now.
Jack, of course, recognizes that uniform, having worn it himself a few years ago.
Very uncomfortable, too, I might tell you.
Heading south on Metcalfe Street now for about 6 or 7 blocks. Before heading east towards Elgin along Laurier and back up northwards towards the War Memorial.
This is the Dead March from Saul by George Frederick Handel.
Quite a remarkable scene. Heading down Ottawa's Metcalfe Street. Deep in the background, you see there the hundreds of veterans who have joined this procession to walk down to join their colleagues who are already at the tomb area. Jack, why has it taken us this long to have a tomb of the unknown soldier?
It's in a sense a relic of colonialism. At the end of the First World War in 1920, the British created a Tomb of the Unknown Soldier in Westminster Abbey, and it was intended to represent the empire nations that had fought the war. It conceivably might be a Canadian who is the unknown soldier in Great Britain, although we'll never know. That sufficed for most Canadians for a long time. And I think it was primarily because the Australians in 1993 decided that they would create their own Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, that in the Canadian Legion in particular. And it took a substantial period of time to persuade the government that this was a good idea, to persuade the Canadian people, I suppose, that this was a good idea.
When the British did that in the early 1920s, there was an enormous amount of secrecy attached to the choosing of the remains for the very fear that the unknown would become known. We saw that happen in the States just a few years ago when a family petitioned to have the remains that were in the tomb of the unknown soldier from Vietnam tested, DNA tested, which of course is something we can do now, we can never do before.
Right.
And they found out it was in fact their son,
Yep.
and the tomb was opened up to give the remains to the family. Now, in this case, as in the Australian case, that could never happen because a government has promised it could never happen.
The remains of Commonwealth soldiers from the First War, the Second War, Korea, and after are in the care of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. And we and all the other nations of the Commonwealth have agreed that this commission should take care of our cemeteries, take care of our dead. Their rules require that no effort be made to determine who soldier. And the Canadian government had to formally agree, as did the Australian, when the grave was opened and the unknown soldier here today was selected, that we would never make any effort to try to determine who it was. And I think that's a solemn guarantee that literally can never be broken.
Procession winding its way down south on Metcalfe Street, downtown Ottawa, roughly halfway along its journey to the War Memorial. Near the War Memorial, our Susan Bonner is standing by with a special guest. Susan?
Peter, thank you. I'm standing here with Major George Pearce, retired from the Canadian Forces, well known, of course, to our viewers because he helps us every year with our memorial coverage. And he's going to help us now. You know, there are so many veterans here today, so many uniforms, so many stories. What is the story of how the veterans came to be represented here today?
Well, Susan, the veterans are represented on their own volition. There was no compulsion. They are here because they want to be here. They need to be here. They were invited, of course. It was promoted by the Legion for the past 2 years. And as soon as they knew that this historic event was going to take place, they showed up to volunteer for active service in 1914 and in 1939.
What regiments are represented here?
Well, there are a great number of them. There's some 375 to 400 personnel from the Canadian Forces in the funeral procession. We'll see representative platoons and guards from the Air Force, the Army, the Navy, the RCMP. As far as the Army is concerned, we've got in the leading detachment members of the 1st Battalion, the Royal Canadian Regiment, and the Parachute Company of the 3rd Battalion, the Royal Canadian Regiment. The firing party will also be from the 1st Battalion, the Royal Canadian Regiment. And representing the primary reserve of the Canadian Army, which was so important during all our wars, We have the 30th Field Regiment, Royal Canadian Artillery, the Bytown Gunners, which we can hear in the background firing the 21-gun salute. They are a regiment of the Primary Reserve. We have also represented on the National War Memorial 10 buglers of the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry, a distinguished regiment who carried the battle honors Dieppe from the 19th of August 1942 and Normandy, and they had among their heroes a chaplain, John Weir Foote, who won the Victoria Cross. And the piper for today is Pipe Major, second only to the Royal Canadian Regiment. So there are a lot of people on parade today. A lot of people.
Thank you. So much history. Peter, thank you very much. Back to you.
Thanks, Susan. The procession now having just turned onto Laurier Avenue. A name that this soldier was probably very familiar with, as the Prime Minister at the turn of the century. You know, it's interesting, Jack, when you watch this procession wind its way through these streets of the nation's capital and having no idea where this soldier came from, whether he'd ever been to Ottawa. There's one thing that can be sure, though. This city and this country has changed a lot since then, and you try to remember, or try to paint the picture of the nation this soldier left behind.
It was a much smaller nation for a start in terms of population. Beginning of the war, it's about 7 million, now 30 million. It was still a majority of a rural population. Industry was scarcely developed at all. We were hewers of wood and drawers of water, literally and figuratively. And to enlist, they left the farms absolutely strapped for labor, and huge efforts had to be found to find people to work on the farms so the crops could be brought in. It was a country that was overwhelmingly English-speaking in percentage terms. Quebec, of course, was French-speaking, but there was relatively little by way of other immigrants. There were substantial numbers of Germans, for example, in what was then Berlin, Ontario, and is now Kitchener, but that name changed during the war for obvious reasons, I guess. But it was very much a country that looked to England as its mother country, as the source of its liberties. A nation that wasn't a nation, that in fact was a colony. We went to war in 1914 when Britain went to war, bound by their declaration of war. In 1939, 25 years later, we made our own declaration of war, and the events of the First World War had helped create the desire for autonomy among Canadians, and the Statute of Westminster in 1931 was the reason that we were in fact independent in law as a nation.